Good afternoon, almost evening. Welcome to our second to last NeMTSS SEL Summer Series. Today we have culturally responsive practices and family partnerships. We're so excited, and hopefully you're finding these very useful if you're watching today or live, or to use in your professional learning opportunities moving forward. You can find all of these at LaunchNE.com. Today we have Casey and Kayla going to bring as much information as they can in a very short hour and a half, you will find. And then next week will be our last of the SEL series with trauma-informed care and restorative practices. So we thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to let Kayla and Casey take it away.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kayla Parr, and I am a part of the Nebraska MTSS team as an early childhood pyramid model implementation facilitator for NeMTSS Region 2, which is ESUs 3, 2, and 19.
And I am Casey Herner. I am an NeMTSS regional lead for Region 3, so I work specifically with ESUs 1, 7, and 8, and then I collaborate with the rest of the team to make sure we have equitable resources across the state. So like we mentioned earlier, today is all about culturally responsive practices and family partnerships. So what we will be learning about today, or learning objectives are, explore what implicit bias is, its impacts, and how to address it, evaluate the role that cultural responsiveness plays in daily interactions, learn to recognize microaggressions, their impacts, and how to address them, and learn strategies to engage and communicate with families and communities in culturally responsive ways. So to begin, what is implicit bias? It's essential to be aware of what it is so we, as individuals, can identify it within ourselves. These attitudes and stereotypes influence us in an unconscious manner, which can be favorable or unfavorable and activated involuntarily. For example, during open house, a staff member might see an overly excited student enter the classroom. They're jumping, they're running, they're going all over the room, they're trying to identify what they see, what they think, and the staff member might think, that child will certainly be a handful this year and might struggle with seat time or independent learning time. So this may or may not be the case with the child as the year unfolds. However, based on that one observation, the staff member unconsciously had an involuntary and unfavorable assessment of the student. This could potentially be detrimental in the student since the staff member already has this implicit bias, which will lead to lower standards and not allow the student to reach their full potential. With that, we'll break down more components and shed light on what implicit biases actually are. So we need to understand that everyone has implicit biases, as they are pervasive in nature. So they're here, they're with us, it's what we do with them that matters. This is why it's so important to understand what they are and how they impact you and others around you. They are mental constructs that are, at times, contradictory in nature. These are feelings and attitudes towards others based on their identities, such as gender and age, ability, race, etc. Many times, not all the time though, these implicit biases favor the group in which we identify with or are actually most familiar with. This could simply be due to a lack of understanding or awareness of various cultural identities or family traditions. The good news is they're very malleable. We as individuals can work to unlearn these implicit biases and assist one another in doing the same. In doing so, though, we first need to understand what some of these implicit biases might be as educators. So in thinking of that, on the next slide, we would like you to consider some different things, and please share in the chat some implicit biases educators might have about students. But as you are doing that, also take note of the visual on the slide. It might help you a little bit when you share your thoughts. So things that might be included above our line of conscious, as you see, there's a line of conscious above, and then there's above the iceberg and below the iceberg. So above our line of conscious, it would be things like dress and food and music. Then at the line of conscious are the hidden rules, which are sometimes discussed, but not all the time. These are the concepts of time, personal space, rules of conduct, facial expressions, things like that. And then we have underneath that line of consciousness, and these are typically unseen and rarely discussed. They're the habits, the assumptions, understandings, values, judgments, nature of friendships, tone of voice, attitude towards others, attitudes towards our elders, concept of cleanliness, preference, competition or cooperation, problem solving, social interactions, things like that. So in thinking of that, as our students are coming back to school soon, what are some examples in the chat, if you could go ahead and put them, what are some examples of implicit biases we might have as educators? Ooh, good one. So beliefs that if a student has an IEP, they cannot meet grade level standards. That's a really perfect one to kind of start off with, is that we make an assumption, not really knowing who the student is, what their struggles are, what their strengths are, but we probably think as teachers, or we could think as teachers, they're probably not going to be successful in my classroom. So that's definitely a good one. A little bit more time. If there are any others. All right. Well, if we kind of move on a little bit, so just to think about that, we need to actively participate in cultures of others to learn internal culture and assist in diminishing this implicit bias. So only overt behaviors are apparent at first. With time, the underlying beliefs, the values, the thought patterns, they can start to be uncovered. One should not judge a new culture based on what we see initially when we participate in cultures of others. We need to be aware as educators of all the various components that make up a person's identity, not just that one specific component. This will just help us make each student feel cared for, reminding us of a quote from the late, great Maya Angelou. So when thinking of this quote on the next slide is, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So this is just really, really important, and really the cornerstone in education of why we need to build relationships with our students and get to know who they are as human beings. They need to be able to feel feel good about themselves, and we can help with that. So when we learn to expose our implicit biases, we are simply better equipped to ensure we are building those good relationships with students and making them feel cared for, and that they have a champion in their corner. And able to do this, we need to address our own implicit bias, though. So what does addressing implicit biases mean? It means when we want to work towards addressing this, we need to deeply explore what our own lived experiences have been and what we have learned from those all around us. We need to, as Peggy McIntosh encourages, unpack our invisible knapsacks. In other words, we need to explore how our identities impact us within the societies we live in. So this critical reflection is the beginning point in understanding our cultural narrative and how the narrative influences those around us. So what experiences have shaped you? Are you or your worldview? And then how do the experiences influence interactions with others? How do these experiences influence your implicit bias? So those are really broad questions to always consider as educators and kind of think about. There are some more specific components too that kind of tie into identity pieces. So if you think about this, if I turn on the television, open the front page of the paper, or open a textbook, do I see people of my race widely represented? Have I or will my children be given curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race? Am I able to find a home to live in within an area that I am not fearful of my life or the lives of my neighbors? If I work in an administrative capacity and I have a gender neutral name, will people assume my gender identity? These are just a few things that not only help us consider our lived experience, but also begin to help us understand what culture is and how it informs the uniqueness of each human being. So now considering a little bit more about what is culture, how can we define it? It's really hard. You have to kind of break it down a little bit because it really speaks to identity of others. There are multiple definitions from seminal work to present work. The definition of culture is not stagnant, since culture is in and of itself not stagnant. This one is adapted from Sonia Nieto. She expressed the notion that culture is ever-changing values, traditions, discourses, practices, social and political relationships, and worldview shared by a group of people bound together by a combination of factors. Some of these factors can include common history, political alignment, geographic location, race, sexual preference, ethnicity, social class, mental health, ability, social identity, and religion. That's a lot to absorb. So, as you notice with some of the factors, there tends to be specific nuances within them that can assist people identifying their own identity. This is essential not only for students to know, but for educators to know as well. Specifically for educators, in order to assist in shedding our implicit and explicit biases and accept students as who they are, we will need to learn more about polarity versus duality, of which Ash Beckham explains perfectly for us. So here, we will just be watching a portion of this video. If you ever have time to watch the whole video, it's just really good, and it breaks down a lot of what happens in society and biases and prejudice. But we'll start at minute 423, and we'll watch it for a couple minutes where she really digs into polarity versus duality.
We are taught right now that we are living in a world of constant and increasing polarity. It's so black and white, so us and them, so right and wrong. There is no middle, there is no gray, just polarity. Polarity is a state in which two ideas or opinions are completely opposite from each other, diametrical opposition. Which side are you on? Are you unequivocally and without question anti-war, pro-choice, anti-death penalty, pro-gun regulation, proponent of open borders, and pro-union? Or are you absolutely and uncompromisingly pro-war, pro-life, pro-death penalty, a believer that the Second Amendment is absolute, anti-immigrant, and pro-business? It's all or none, you're with us or against us. That is polarity. Now, the problem with polarity and absolutes is that it eliminates the individuality of our human experience, and that makes it contradictory to our human nature. But if we're pulled in these two directions, but it's not really where we exist, polarity is not our actual reality, where do we go from there? What's at the other end of that spectrum? And I don't think it's some unattainable, harmonious utopia. I think the opposite of polarity is duality. Now, duality is a state of having two parts, but not in diametrical opposition in simultaneous existence. Don't think it's possible? Here are the people I know. I knew Catholics who are pro-choice, and feminists who wear hijabs, and veterans who are anti-war, and NRA members who think I should be able to get married. Those are the people I know. Those are my friends and family. That is the majority of our society. That is you. That is me. Duality is the ability to hold both things. But the question is, can we own our duality? Can we have the courage to hold both things? So I work at a restaurant in town and became really good friends with the busser. I was a server, and we had—
Go ahead and stop it, Kayla.
We had a really great time together.
All right, so if you haven't watched Ash Beckham or seen any of her stuff, she really does start digging into, like I said, bias, prejudice, stereotypes in our society, to really start making others feel like it's okay to own your own identity. So one of the questions she has or poses towards the end there is, can we own our duality? Do we have courage to hold both things? When we assist our students in bringing their full selves, all components of their cultural identity to the classroom, we need to be prepared that there might be some components we do not understand. We need to be prepared that there might be some components that are not like ours. Understanding is the first step, but practicing duality is what needs to occur. In order to do this, we need to better understand cultural identity and how we can assist students in embracing their own, as well as those of others. So in thinking about that, cultural identity in and of itself can be defined as a dynamic, multidimensional construct that refers to one's identity or sense of self in relation to their culture. As with culture, this is also fluid for individuals. There are several ways to assist students in honoring their own cultural identity and that of others. So one of these ways would be to create a cultural identity starburst, which we'll kind of explore on the next slide here a little bit. So if you look at the starburst identity chart, it can help students visualize the difference between factors that they feel make up their identities. So arrows pointing out from the center versus the labels that others place on them, which are the arrows pointing into the center. So they would place their own identity pieces based on what they think others think of them and then what they think of themselves as well. So because we may agree with some ways that the outside world views us and disagree with others, there may be some overlapping ideas between the two sets of arrows. To have them complete this activity, they need to know that the arrows pointing outward, the words and the phrases that describe what they consider to be key aspects of their identity. At the arrows end, then again, they write the labels that others might think of them. And they can always add more arrows as needed. Students can also use examples from text, so they can bring in a social emotional context to it too. So they can use examples from text to create the starburst charts for characters and historical figures to help express the complexities of their identities in the stories or the text that they're reading. And it assists, so that could help them assist with building perspective of others, which also ties into a lot of empathy. This activity is a simple way to build the relationships within the classrooms because it also helps to break down the stereotypes, ultimately leading to what we want, a positive classroom and school climate for all. So think for a moment with all of that said. In general, do you think there's any part of a student's identity that they keep private in order to be accepted? If so, what? So in the chat, we would like you to answer that. Do you think students come to us thinking they need to keep a component of their identity private in order to feel accepted in either the school, in order to feel accepted in society as a whole? What parts of identity do you think they might have to keep private? So kind of give you about a minute to think and write in the chat. So religion popped up already. So they might be fearful of sharing what religion they're coming from. Parts of their home life. So that can be positive or negative. They might live a very affluent life and they don't want to share that because their friends might not, and it could be the opposite. Very good. Keeping a learning disability private. So instead of they act like a funny guy, or a funny person, so they're not acting as the dumb one in the classroom. That's definitely something we've seen before as educators. So poverty came up as one of them, definitely. Cultural, religious customs, types of dress even, yep. Definitely our sexual orientation, abuse at home, religion, depression, our parents. Yeah, so these are all really, really great things that unfortunately our students coming to school, where it's supposed to be a safe haven, they're not willing to share with us. So that's something we definitely need to dig down into. So their home life, religion, learning problems, life without food, politics, emotions. So there's just a bundle of things that we can expect many students coming to school and trying to hide. So as educators, how are we going to create a better climate at school to help assist them so they don't feel like they have to hide anything? What can we do as educators to help them in being more comfortable being who they are, exactly how they are? Something to work toward is the process of cultural proficiency. So when we think of cultural proficiency, we think of ensuring culturally responsive practices are embedded, and it's something that we know as educators on the cultural proficiency continuum. So without this awareness, we aren't able to meet the needs of all learners. Although as we go through these, I'm going to hit on each one of these and what they all mean, starting with cultural destructiveness all the way through cultural proficiency. So as we do this, I want you to kind of sit back and reflect on your own where you are on the continuum, because we're all on the continuum somewhere. It's very fluid as well. So kind of take some time to think, where are you at, and where are rooms that you can grow? So starting with cultural destructiveness, this is any policy, any practice, or any behavior that effectively eliminates other cultures. So at times these are intentional, but many times are unwittingly carried out as part of prevailing practice. So it's something that's just always been done, so we just keep doing it. An example of this would be the absence of many people and events in school curricula. So then the next one comes is the cultural incapacity. This is any policy, practice, or behavior that presumes one culture is superior to others. In doing so, cultural incapacity tolerates differences without valuing that diversity. So this is practiced by holding low expectations for students due to a specific part of their identity. Then we go into cultural blindness. This is any policy, practice, or behavior that ignores existing cultural differences or that considers such differences inconsequential. So many times this is quite unintentional and people speak out of goodwill, but they say things like, I do not see color, we're all human beings. When we do not see differences, one can presume that the dominant cultural norms are equally beneficial for all. And that's just not true. So another example of this would be the American melting pot metaphor. So this would indicate that cultural uniqueness is not valued and everyone would melt into the dominant cultural norms. So that's really, really destructive, even though that's only cultural blindness. It actually destroys somebody's cultural well-being. So beyond cultural blindness, we go into cultural precompetence. The people and organizations that are culturally precompetent recognize that their skills and practices are limited when interacting with cultural groups. There have been some changes in their approaches, but they are aware they need assistance and more information. An example of this could be looking over gated achievement data, focusing on the lowest quartile and knowing that something needs to change, but not actually taking the action to do so due to the lack of know-how. So it's how we always have these conversations. We need to put the conversation. That's cultural precompetence. So then we go into cultural competence, is any policy, practice, or behavior that uses easting to diversity and institutionalizing culture. Culturally competent educators realize that all learners have the capacity to learn, and that is their responsibility to create an environment in which the learner can use that capacity for learning. And then finally, we have cultural proficiency. This is manifests in organizations and people who esteem culture, who know how to learn about individual and organizational cultures, and who interact effectively with a variety of cultural groups. It's an ongoing and unfolding process as you learn about yourself, your organization, and people who work with you. You do not need to know everything. There is to know about diversity. That's simply impossible. However, it does mean that you have learned how to learn and to be a student of culture and a cultural informant to others about cultural expectations and of environments that you do know well. So as teams, so when we think of our NeMTSS framework, as teams, these components can certainly be explored, and action steps to create movement along the continuum can be designed. Part of this, however, is also to dig deeper into ourselves and explore various privileges we might have due to components of our identities. So the next video will assist us in exploring just that.
Some people are born into families where they have to walk miles just to get water. All I have to do is turn on a faucet. That's privilege.
Ever tried to change your speech if you were embarrassed about your clothes or house? If you never think twice about calling the police when trouble?
I think privilege is when some people have some things and other people don't have things.
I feel privilege is something that you don't even really have control over. I think it'd be silly for me to say I don't have a fair amount of privilege, considering like the country I live in and the job I get to do and the college I was allowed to go to.
I suppose being a white male will help me end up somewhere towards the front, but I'll take a few steps back from being gay.
I don't think I'll make it to the front. I think I'll maybe be in the middle. That's just a gut feeling I have.
If your parents work nights and weekends to support your family, take one step back. If you can show affection for your romantic partner in public without fear of ridicule or violence, take one step forward. If you were embarrassed about your clothes or house while growing up, take one step back. If you have ever been diagnosed as having a physical or mental illness or disability, take one step back. If you have ever been bullied or made fun of based on something you can't change, take one step back. If you get time off for your religious holidays, take one step forward. If you came from a supportive family environment, if you can see a doctor whenever you feel the need, if you're able to move through the world without fear of sexual assault, if you took out loans for your education, if there were more than 50 books in your house right now. So these are your final positions.
I think it felt kind of strange for everyone.
It's a hard thing to discuss or even reflect on. It was very awkward. I think when you can represent it so visually like this and so immediately, it definitely takes on a new form.
I think we were like all joking around in the beginning. It was pretty lighthearted. And as soon as the questions started coming in, the mood shifted immediately. And we all it was just silent.
Just looking back and seeing like a bunch of people behind you is not a good feeling.
It's like weird how you want to like hold on to explaining a certain privilege. Like, oh, but that's not actually me because like I had to work really hard for that. So it's weird to like take a step forward when you feel like you're taking a step forward with someone else, but you wear a lot of the baggage of like how those things were hard. It was like more emotional than I thought it would be.
It reminded me of when they talk about slavery in high school and you feel like angry for a few days, but then you just realize like, this is how it is.
For me, it was kind of frustrating almost to look back and see how much further some people were behind me and realizing that, you know, a lot of that stuff, no amount of hard work or even legislation can make up that gap.
It's interesting being an Asian American because you're not really sure where you fall on the spectrum of privilege.
I know that for me, one of the reasons I ended up so far back was that there are questions around safety as an African American, as a woman, as a gay woman. There are just so many different ways that I don't feel safe.
I feel like I just learned to be grateful for what you have. You know, we're in such a huge society where it's always complaining about what you don't have.
It just shows you that for some families, like each family, you're meant to do better. My grandparents did good, my parents did good, and I'll do even better.
I do think if you're not like aware of privilege, you should do this exercise, but it's more complicated.
All right, so it's please take note, it's not necessarily something that comes easy to everyone. Talking about their privilege, it's not something that can be accomplished in an unsafe environment. So trying to do one of these privilege walks is probably not the best idea to build capacity in staff and understanding what privilege is, but showing the video might be helpful. This takes understanding, it takes an open mind, this takes incredible self and societal reflection. Most importantly, this takes a whole lot of trust. So the discussion of privilege in our country is one of those courageous conversations that simply must be had. This again ties back to those invisible knapsacks. Peggy McIntosh encourages individuals to explore and assist in determining what advantages one might have based on their own cultural identity. So just some things to think about. So now what we would like you to do is in the chat again, if you could just, as educators, how do we begin these critical conversations and critical discourse so we are able to understand, accept, and celebrate cultural differences and assist students in doing the same? So what are some different ways, and where do we even start? Is a loaded question and a loaded. So if you could give us some ideas in the chat, where do we begin? Very good. Represent student culture within the school environment. So just make sure that we are encompassing a lot of different types of cultures in the environment. You can teach about different cultures you have in the classroom. Read a book. If you're looking into like early childhood settings, read a book to start identifying different types of cultures within our SEL core curriculum and all the materials that we do. So making sure we're evaluating and utilizing materials that are broad in different cultural realms. Very good. So those are really good, great points. Ask questions to people different than who we are and truly listen to them. I think that's a key point. Is there's one thing to ask and have somebody tell you that, but actually listen to them and then also do something with that information. Very good. Have parents come in and share about their culture. Very good. At this point in time, they could also Zoom in. Excellent point. So thinking about all of that, Kayla will now take us into exploring what are culturally responsive teaching practices.
All right. Hi, everyone. So I'm pleased to see all your responses in the chat because all your responses are alluding to exactly what we're going to dive into. So next we're going to take a look at culturally responsive teaching. And in a culturally responsive classroom, we look to see learners' varied identities and experiences are identified, that they're honored and used to bridge rigorous new learning to benefit all students as a Tier 1 practice. It is important to spend time learning about your students. You can do this through distributing questionnaires, asking about their interests, hand out surveys, gather information about their learning styles, and have open discussions through home visits or classroom visits, allowing students and their families to talk about their experiences. Being the beginning of the school year, it is critical that we learn as much as we can about not only our students, but their families. And then you can take this information that you've gathered and bring it to your teaching practice as well as your classroom environment. Because we know when you embed culturally responsive teaching into your classroom, it improves the classroom climate. It allows for individuals to have a positive sense of racial and ethnic identity, as well as encourages staff and students to understand the fact that differences are not deficits. Knowing culturally responsive practices, they use the cultural capital of the child to inform and drive all teaching and learning. Let's learn about the 7 principles of culturally responsive practices and how they affect student learning. So, as you see, number 1, when students are honored in their cultural connections, kids get that we get them. They feel honored and recognized. Number 2, when teachers are personally and culturally inviting, students or kids get that we like them. Thirdly, when a classroom is physically and culturally inviting and children can see themselves in the classroom through books and games, they may say, "School looks like me." 4, If students' academic development is viewed through a strength-based lens, you can catch kids being good. Teachers then see kids from a strength-based lens. Number 5, when teachers use strategies to meet the needs of unique cultural styles of children through singing in harmony with the child's favorite song, this builds a positive classroom climate to support students' learning while honoring their cultural backgrounds of all students. 6, when your classroom management is caring and consistent, this shows the children their teacher respects them. And lastly, when instruction is individual as well as collective, students' learning is centered around them and their own needs. So this quote, expecting students to learn only from a book is like asking them to look at a travel brochure and calling it a vacation. Culturally responsive teaching allows for learning to be demonstrated in a variety of ways, utilizing the cultural uniqueness of each student and allowing for culminating experiences. It is more than a brochure. It is more than food and clothes. It is understanding what makes them who they are and allowing them to explore more about themselves and their classmates. So culturally responsive educators, you can become a culturally responsive educator by providing opportunities for students to explore themselves and learn more about who they are. Culturally responsive educators can deepen their understanding of how identity markers influence the educational opportunities that learners receive and might ask, where are the best teachers assigned? Which students take advanced courses? Or where are resources allocated? These guiding questions would assist in ensuring that biases are not playing a part in decision-making of our educational systems. With this, they are more equipped in understanding that biases might shape how they work with students and families. This is why it's so essential to understand how biases form and how to shed them. As we have discussed previously, this critical conversation and discourses are what can be used to not only understand biases, prejudice, and stereotypes, but also allow educators in becoming culturally proficient and advocating for equitable opportunities for all. So these equitable learning opportunities allow for scaffolding in Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 that allow for culturally relevant materials for all students, as well as planned learning opportunities to validate the identities of student-lived realities. These learning encounters could be having them interview family members, integrating related word problems, guest speakers, empowering students to share their perspectives, and ensuring various forms of media representation across various cultures. With this, it is also essential to evaluate all instructional materials to prohibit stereotypes and ensure various cultural backgrounds are represented. If this happens to be a stereotype, and if there happens to be a stereotype in one of the materials, it might be a good opportunity to explore what makes it a stereotype and tie it to understanding cultural identities of others, as well as empathy for others. Culturally responsive educators have the capacity to explore these topics with students due to the positive climate of their classroom that they build. This part of this positive classroom climate is due to the support and partnerships that they have with families. From early childhood through graduation, educators have the opportunity to learn about their students through these family partnerships, which better enables them in providing the enriching and culturally responsive experiences every student deserves. All of this, of course, comes with astounding impacts. So what are the impacts of implementation? Culturally responsive practices affirm and sustain the cultural uniqueness the child brings into the classroom environment. Culturally responsive practitioners use the culture of the child as the foundation for teaching and learning. And thirdly, children's cultural identity is developed, embraced, and viewed as a strength in culturally responsive classrooms. So when we look at elements of engagement within an atmosphere, we can look forward, or when we have those elements of engagement within an atmosphere, we can look forward to even more success in our students' achievement by creating a culturally responsive, positive environment for parent engagement. This is critical because it sets a stage of readiness for engagement for parents, teachers, administrators, and community members to work closely together. Above are just a few elements of an engaged atmosphere, and you can see a commitment from you as the educator to engage with parents in the decision making that impacts the quality of education for their child. Also creating a school culture where parents are seen as important partners in school efforts to increase student success. So we're going to ask you to reflect on our practice or on your practices in considering the quality of how we are engaging with parents. It is useful to take time to reflect on the following questions and to engage in thoughtful analysis of our personal practice in parent engagement as educators. So I'm just going to pose a few questions for you to reflect on in your own personal practice around parent engagement. So as an educator, do you consistently value and acknowledge the strengths and gifts that parents from diverse backgrounds and languages can bring to the teaching and learning process? If so, how do you do that? Am I willing to implement varied approaches to engage parents from diverse linguistic and ethnic backgrounds meaningfully as partners in the community of learners? And lastly, how would I describe my state of interaction with parents? Tired, enthusiastic, stressed, forced, open, relaxed, or willing to implement new ideas and perspectives? We ask you those questions because there is a need to engage families. It promotes positive family engagement, can increase class participation and establish positive interactions for students to promote better social skills, resulting in improved behaviors. It also provides connection between school and students' long-term goals. It also it engages families and is linked to positive impacts on student outcomes. So this quote comes to mind when we think about our parent and family engagement. Cultural congruence between the child's home and school is the cornerstone of culturally responsive practices. So having that harmony between school, the child's school, and home is critical in their positive outcomes that we see within schools and at home. So I'm going to turn it over to Casey, and we're going to talk a little more about the connections between microaggressions.
Yes, so as Kayla mentioned, we need to ensure we're working to connect with families and ensure there is cultural congruence to meet the needs of all learners through cultural proficiency. One way of accomplishing this is being very cognizant of microaggressions. These are the everyday messages that target persons based on solely on their marginalized group membership. There are times in which these are purposeful, and there are times in which the person saying them does not realize it is even negative or derogatory communication. The next video we will share with you will allow us to explore some examples of what microaggressions are and how they impact others, and it is from a child's perspective.
Oh, you're so pretty for a black girl. Oh, she has a Jew nose. Oh, your hair would look so good if it was straight. Jews are so cheap. Why are you so cheap?
Do you speak good English?
How are you an Iraqi Jew?
I think the person saying microaggression kind of doesn't really think about it.
This person who said it was my friend, and like I was astonished they would like say something like that.
You don't want to make a big deal about it, but then it's also like you just said something that offended me, so I feel like I should speak up.
Because they're micro, because they're very subtle, they're small, you feel like you don't have a reason to be upset. You're overreacting, and people even can make you feel that way when you bring it up. They're like, oh, you can't take a joke.
You're making too big of a deal of this. Why are you overreacting?
Don't take it so seriously. It was just a joke. Chill out. Say like, oh no, I actually love black people. I love people of color. Like they try to just minimize the situation.
If someone feels hurt by a microaggression, it shouldn't just be pushed to the side.
It definitely has negative impacts and like leads to people disliking who they actually are. Those kinds of subtle offensive comments can build up over time, and they can have like a deep psychological effect, and you know, they can make you feel bad and they can make you doubt yourself.
We try to just use jokes to like make things less awkward or like ease social experiences, but it is important because you need to like be aware of what you're saying and like who you're speaking to.
Think of what you say and how it can affect the person you're saying it to.
So this is just a really powerful video that allows adults to understand what it feels like from a child's perspective. So as educators, we can certainly learn from the video exactly how much impact words have on students. The most profound part of this video was the statement, microaggressions have a huge impact and actually lead to people disliking who they are. I think that's exactly opposite of what we're working towards as a society, what we're working towards as different educational systems, and what we want for our students. So we need to really consider that and take note of that. So as we dig a little bit more into microaggressions, how do we address them? It's going to be helpful to know a little bit more about them. This is obviously not a huge component of what we're doing today, but it definitely is a piece to making people feel inadequate. So here are some different ways that we can look to address them a bit. We can first of all recognize what they are. So if you have to say at any point in time, you do that well for a girl, or you do that well for an elderly person, or you do that well for any other piece of somebody's identity, it's obviously a microaggression. So I think just understanding that in our language and helping others understand that is really important. We need to be able to embrace differences as an asset and as a strength, so have that growth mindset. We need to create opportunities for critical discourse and address microaggressions as part of that. So the only way to do this, though, is to create that positive climate of trust. If we don't have trust, we can't have critical discourse. People will just shut off and not listen. We need to engage in professional development opportunities that focus on diversity, on equity, and on inclusion. We need to also challenge the microaggression when it occurs. Again, this is only done in a very trusting environment, so it keeps going back to that whole idea of climate and building that positive climate. We also need to create opportunities to exchange ideas. So that develops a foundation for innovation. So again, we would like you to participate a little bit with us. in the chat, what are ways in which educators can sensitively and carefully respond when they hear a microaggression being used? So that sometimes it can come off as harsh, or you're trying to shut somebody down. So I think we need to know how to do it carefully and sensitively to make sure we're not shutting other people down or making them feel less than either. So what are some ways, what are some statements that we can use in doing so? So someone had commented just a general statement about microaggressions, that they happen way too often in the gender realm, and that's absolutely correct. I think that kind of goes back to when I was kind of discussing some questions to consider and answer, as if you are in a leadership role and you have a gender neutral name, what gender do they automatically assume you are? That's happened to me more times than people probably know. With the first name Casey, people assume that I am a male. I've even college students that I teach assume that I'm a male because it's either Dr. Herner or Casey. So I think that's just always interesting that our lead assumption, administrator in education, equals male still. So very good point. All right, so some other ways that we could potentially address these microaggressions is maybe speaking to the person right after in private, have that discussion. It could be that the next day in class, we just have a generalized discussion and weave that into the content of our material of what are microaggressions or what are hurtful things. It kind of depends on your age level. Explain to students that anybody can do anything they want to, and that they have everybody has strengths. That's a great one. Or just simply stopping and saying, what do you mean by that? Or tell me more. That's always a great way to kind of stop and redirect students. Very good. All right, so these were all really good discussion points, and definitely directly relate to connecting with families, which Kayla will explore with us next.
All right, so just as you shared in the chat and Casey talked through, is kids experience these things at school and they bring it home to their families. And so it's important that we're able to have conversations not only with the children or students about these microaggressions that occur, but also with their families, because again, it crosses both boundaries into both settings. So some ideas for family connection strategies that you could build upon. The first bullet is looking at building relationships and just being present. So this all starts with starting the conversation and keeping the child's learning at the center of the questions that you ask, being sure that you listen and also share. It's important to talk with families in their communities to help build relationships, that common or mutual understanding and respect for one another. Other ideas that you could try are to enjoy neighborhood walks and porch visits. This version is a less intrusive form of a home visit for those early childhood teachers or even K-12 teachers who are wanting to make the connections with families in the community or within their home setting. Becoming familiar with the community by attending street fairs or other local events that your families or students attend within the community. Other ideas or strategies to connect with families are to, again, engage with community organizations, recognize, honor, and promote existing knowledge, identify and use what works for each family, promote a culture of awareness, learning, and sharing, and foster community by building social capital. You can do these things by having that family connection, in inviting linguistically diverse families to teach or share their primary language, have culturally diverse families assist you when purchasing books for the school or decorating the school building or sharing student work in the classroom or hallways. It's important to shed light or shed ideas on what family engagement should be or could be, as many families haven't had a positive experience. So talking with them about what it is you want your partnership to look like and how you see it fit. You can host storytelling sessions and listening groups in which teachers, students, and their families gather together to prepare, share personal experiences. Host reading groups in which teachers and families can read books and articles and examine unconscious bias, culture, and other relevant topics that again can help break down those barriers that exist. And as we're looking to foster community and build social capital, host just mingling events or just small, it doesn't have to be these big family fun days. They can just be those minor things of having additional conversations about their child, because when we create that knowledge sharing or sharing of knowledge, again, those are just pieces to build on those family connections or those family partnerships that have impacts on your students. We are in a unique time where there is learning at home going on, and so it's important that we're still able to connect with our families, as we know it's so important for our students. So this slide here just shows tips that will help you to be focused and responsive during a phone call or a virtual meeting that you have with families. And you can just simply start by opening the conversation. It's important to check in with how they're doing, develop a plan together, or problem solve if there's any barriers or issues that are pertaining outside of the time that they have with you. And then to review, summarize what you talked about and what are your next steps, and then have a predictable timeline. So when will you be back in contact with them? So it eliminates some of those unknowns that we can't necessarily manage all the time. Further tips for you to consider when you're having these conversations are to anticipate the needs and have resources available for families or to share with families. Map out what you want to share using the guide previously before you make the call. So have, again, a plan before you pick up the phone or join that Zoom meeting. What is it that you want to discuss or accomplish during that time? Also be able to help families identify what they're doing well and provide that affirmation. Just as students need that affirmation, families do too, because this is an uncomfortable circumstance for them. They're not used to being seen as that in that teacher lens, even though we know they're their child's first teacher. But when it comes to the academic lens or challenging behaviors that typically they look for guidance from the school, it's important to provide and acknowledge their strengths that they have, because they have many. You don't have to be the expert or solve all the problems. If you don't know the answer to a question that they might pose, just say, that is a good question, and let me see what I can find out. It's important to use those active listening phrases, as you can see a few listed there for you, and always ask those open-ended questions. So again, you're seeing similar strategies that we use with our students that again will work with families. So we're going to leave you with some tips for your conversations as we move into the unknown of this next school year. And with that, it's important that we establish a culture of trust. So if we are starting the school year in this unknown territory, it's even more critical that we can establish this culture of trust with our families. We'll leave you with this quote. The trust of people in the leaders reflects the confidence of the leaders in the people. This form of trust is two-way. We as educators must instill a sense of trust within our own classrooms, school buildings, and with families. And oftentimes, this trust is built when families see the love you have for their child. It doesn't always take these grand ideas. It's the family seeing the love that you have for their child. And when their child comes home and talks about the great experiences they had throughout their day with their teacher and with their friends, that's the foundation. And then you can build upon the conversation strategies shared above. But we want to start with building that culture of trust before we jump into some of those deeper conversations that even Casey talked about earlier. Family partnerships, there's implementation impacts, and family engagement in schools contribute to positive outcomes for students, including improved child and student achievement, decreased disciplinary issues, improved parent-teacher and student-teacher relationships, and improved school environment. It also implementation impact of family partnerships, also involving families in strength-based decision-making processes and modeling appropriate problem-solving approaches increases families' comfort with communicating their own problem-solving strategies and exploring new strategies that may benefit themselves and their children. And to continue on the implementation impacts of family partnership is working collaboratively increases the likelihood of identifying a family's unique needs and developing relevant and culturally appropriate service plans that address needs, build on family strengths, draw from community supports, and use resources more effectively. Knowing the impacts family partnerships has on children, why wouldn't we work hard to be intentional in our efforts of partnership?
Definitely. So as we kind of move on and we're kind of getting to the end, the summary components of our presentation, we want to give you a moment to explore your rose, your bud, and your thorn for 2 minutes. So your rose would be something positive or worthy of celebration. Your bud would be something you are looking forward to based on culturally responsive practices or family partnerships. And your thorn is something you might need help with. So when it comes to implicit bias, when it comes to culturally responsive practices, microaggressions, or family partnerships, what would be something that you might need help with? So then we want you to consider and actually put in the chat, if we could get participation, that would be awesome. What would it take to turn your thorn into a rose? So when you have a thorn, what would it take to turn it back into a rose? And that kind of will give us a little gauge on at the NeMTSS level, like what can we do and what can we provide to assist you with that? So for example, I need more practical and hands-on culturally responsive strategies to embed in my classroom, or I need assistance in identifying more efficient ways to involve guardians in my community. So if your thorn was guardian and community engagement or culturally responsive practices, then you would put that on how you would turn your thorn back into a rose. So we will give you 2 minutes to kind of think a little bit, your rose, your bud, your thorn, and what would need to be true to turn that thorn back into a rose. So 2 minutes. as you wrap up some of your thinking, there are a couple that came in, so I'd like to share them. I would like to get more parents in the classroom talking about different cultures, but sometimes it's hard to get parents in the classroom due to work. Some also may not feel comfortable doing so. That's a really great thought, and we can only reach out and invite as much as we possibly can, and be told no as much as we possibly can. But I would just say keep building the trust. I know Kayla she did a great job talking about trust, build the trust, build the trust. I really do think once the trust is built, and it's built more and more, that might open more windows. But obviously if it's because of work and they just simply can't, maybe they can record themselves and do a little video and send it to you, and you can share that in the classroom, or maybe they'd be willing to do something like that. So that could be a possible way to do. Parent involvement and interaction inside class and outside of class. I do think that the community and parent involvement, it is a really difficult thing. And I don't know if Kayla, you have any other thoughts off of what they're asking too, but I think out of everything, the more we can involve on our leadership team. So if you're thinking of the construction of your leadership teams, your MTSS teams, involving parents, and the more you involve them, the more they might talk, and the more they might talk, the more people might want to actually start participating on things like that. But
yeah, I was just going to add too, oftentimes parents within a particular school building know parents of other students within the school building. And so even making those connections of maybe there's family members, cousins within that same school building to build upon those existing relationships. Other thoughts are, I know in early childhood there's a sign in and sign out process. I know it's short and sweet. They come in and pick up their kids, but it's also a small window that we have to share something about the day or about their child. Again, making it very intentional and specific to their child. Sometimes, again, like I said in the previous slides, we tend to look at family engagement as these extravagant PTO groups, and it really just doesn't have to be that. It can be a phone call outside of their work hours. I know everyone's busy throughout the day, or they may work nights, so it might be helpful to kind of have a better understanding of what their schedule is and just make a positive phone call, because parents are typically used to those negative, your child did this type of phone call. And so if you surprise them with reaching out to share some great news of the day, and if you can't get them over the phone, I always used notebooks. I would write notes to those families that I wouldn't see on a daily basis, or for students who ride the bus. Put a journal, or have a journal that you can place in their book bag and use that. It takes time, but again, it's worth it. So those are just some ideas that I have off the top of my head.
Perfect. All right. So to kind of, we've got another good one here. Making sure your building is inviting to the various cultures. That's a really, really important one. Very good. If families, parents feel wanted and welcome as they walk in the door, they may be more comfortable and they may be more apt to share. Love that one. So just making sure it's welcome. And I think we keep going back to this climate and the idea of a positive school climate and building climate. And it's just more critical than I think people are aware of or they realize. But it's that feeling you get when you walk into the building. So our parents feel it, our students feel it, and our staff feels it. Everybody feels it when they walk into the building. And we want them to feel welcomed, and we want them to feel like they belong there and they deserve to be there. And they want to come back over and over again. So very good point. Thank you. So to wrap up our presentation, we do want to make sure that you're aware of other professional development opportunities. So on the next slide, we have our 2020 virtual summit coming up. There's a link for you to sign up. It's a great lineup of national presenters with a strategic focus of social emotional learning through equity, developing a positive climate, and ensuring the needs of students are being met. However, before the summit begins next week, there will also be our last summer adult SEL series. The focus area is trauma-informed care and restorative practices. So if you want to participate, go ahead and just go on to the Launch Nebraska website and you can sign up for next week's. And if you need to get a hold of anybody or if you need more help or assistance, please take note of our state and regional supports. If you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out whatsoever. In case you missed it, there's a link in the chat that will also give you access to the resources from the presentation from today. Good news is we were able to wrap up a little bit ahead of time, but we want to thank you. We are so glad to have all of you participate, and our team hopes to work with you as needed. We hope you have an excellent evening.